Another Sunday morning, another time that we gather for worship. And as we gather, we want to prepare ourselves for this worship time. We want to pray and invite God to be with us today, that God might be at work in our hearts today. So as the prelude plays, I would invite you to be prayerful and invite God to be present with us today. Let us prepare our hearts for worship.
Our first lesson today comes from Matthew 5:17 through 20. And this is part of the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus gave. Okay. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly, I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
Our second lesson continues from the same chapter, Matthew 5:21 through 30. You have heard that it was said to those of ancient times, "You shall not murder, and whoever murders shall be liable to judgment." But I say to you that if you are angry with a brother or sister, you will be liable to judgment, and if you insult a brother or sister, you will be liable to the council. And if you say, "You fool," you will be liable to the hell of fire. So when you are offering your gift at the altar, if you remember that your brother or sister has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go. First be reconciled to your brother or sister, and then come and offer your gift. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way to court with him, or your accuser may hand you over to the judge, and the judge to the guard, and you will be thrown into prison. Truly, I tell you, you will never get out until you have paid the last penny. You have heard it said, "You shall not commit adultery." But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lust has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, tear it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to be thrown in hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one of your members than for your whole body to go into hell. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. And picking up where Mary Beth left off, we continue to read of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' teaching. You have heard it said, "An eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth." But I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. But if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. And if anyone wants to sue you and take your coat, give your cloak as well. And if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the 2nd mile. Give to everyone who begs from you, and do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, "You shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy." But I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be children of your Father in heaven. For he makes his sun rise on the evil and on the good, and sends rain on the righteous and on the unrighteous. For if you love those who love you, what reward do you have? Do not even the tax collectors do the same? And if you greet only your brothers and sisters, what more are you doing than others? Do not even the Gentiles do the same? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
As we continue our look at the Sermon on the Mount, these words that we read today can be very disheartening. I mean, they're tough. They're tough words. Jesus says, "I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law." And it's not going anywhere. It's going to stay here. And then he throws in the kicker. Unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and the Pharisees, you'll never enter into the kingdom of heaven. Now, that would have been radical words to the people that were listening to Jesus preach that day. And they should be radical words for us too. For you see, the scribes and the Pharisees were the most religious people you could find. They knew the law, and they followed the law strictly. Now, there were 248 regulations, things that you were supposed to do, rules and regulations. There were 365 prohibitions, things you weren't supposed to do. How in the world could you expect someone to know 600 plus rules and regulations and prohibitions? Well, the scribes and the Pharisees knew each and every one of them. Had them memorized. Followed them strictly to the letter of the law. In fact, they would even write more laws to explain how you keep the other laws. They were the most religious people around. And Jesus says, your righteousness has to be better than theirs. And then if that wasn't enough, he throws out 6 examples that make it even harder. He equates anger with murder, lust with adultery. He does away with the common views of divorce, saying you can't just write a certificate of divorce and give it to your wife and it's done. It has to be for a reason, for adultery only. He then talks about you don't make oaths. You don't swear by God or God's throne or the temple or the gold of the temple or anything else. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Be a person of your word. Be honest. And then he talks about revenge. You know, you've read an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. You know, that those were good restrictions, that you didn't overreact to something somebody did bad to you. But Jesus says, no, that's not how it's going to work. If somebody slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the left cheek. Turn the other cheek. If one of the Roman soldiers forces you to carry his pack for a mile, well, you carry it for him 2 miles. Give to people who want to borrow from you. You know, these are hard things that Jesus is saying we've got to do. Now, we make laws all the time. We need laws to keep our society functioning in order. You know, we need the law not to murder. We need the law not to steal, to lie. We saw that we read the 10 Commandments for our call to worship. These are laws that you can keep. We need these type of laws, but Jesus is going deeper than this. Jesus is saying it's not just following the letter of the law, but you've got to follow the spirit of the law. What is the intention behind the law? And you know, we read about keeping the Sabbath. Don't work on the Sabbath. And for the Jews, it was a day of worship. For us, it's a day of worship. We come to church, and we can keep the Sabbath by coming to church, but we can also miss the spirit of the law by saying, I'm going to go, but I'm not going to pay attention. I'm not going to listen. I'm not going to sing. I might even fall asleep during the sermon. Missing the spirit of the law. You know, it says, don't commit adultery. Well, I'm going to keep my marriage vows. I'm not going to commit adultery. Except up here. I'm going to do it up here. It's okay. It's up here. We can keep the letter of the law and totally ignore the spirit of the law. And Jesus says, no, that's not how it works. You can't separate the letter of the law from the spirit of the law. You can't separate just doing the right thing with doing it for the right reason. The motive and the reason have to go together. You know, we can legislate law that prevents discrimination, but you can't legislate prejudice. You can't legislate prejudice out of something. That's in the heart. God is the one that can change the heart. God is the one that can change our motives. And this is where Jesus is saying our righteousness has to exceed that of the Pharisees. They strictly follow the letter of the law. But we're going to follow not just the letter, but the spirit of the law. Not like the Pharisees. Now, I do have a confession I have to make. I am a Pharisee, in the worst sense of the word that Jesus said it. I'm happy to say I was a much better Pharisee when I was younger than I am now. Thank God for that. If there was a 12-step program for Pharisees, sign me up. My name is Duke. I am a Pharisee. I grew up in the church. I grew up believing I had to do the right thing. And I tried to do that. And I think that's good because it saved me a lot of heartache later on in life if I'd been doing the wrong things. But it also created in me this belief that I had to do the right thing in order to please God. I had to do, and as I did the right thing, I became very judgmental of others because they weren't necessarily doing the right thing. Shame on them. And it got even worse. It was like if they got to do the right thing the same way I do the right thing because I'm doing it the right way. And if they're not doing it my way, they're not doing it the right way. And then I would start putting my spiritual priorities, kind of laying that on them. They need to be having the same spiritual priorities that I have. And if they don't, well, again, they're not doing the right thing. Oh, I was a good Pharisee. And I knew the words that we're saved by grace through faith. I knew that. You don't earn it. You can't gain it through your good works. It's a gift. Up here, I knew that. Here, I struggled with that. It's always, I gotta do this. I gotta do this right. And I remember, and like I said, I knew that sometimes up here. And sometimes I'd become more aware of it. But I remember the time that it really hit me and things started to change. It was when I was in seminary. I was in this urban training program where I worked at a church in the city, and we took classes together. And one of those classes we took, we gathered together and we would share the experiences that we were having in the city, in our churches. And it would be critiqued and evaluated by others so that we might learn from the process things we're doing wrong, things we're doing right, and all of that. And it was my turn one time, and I don't remember what the example was that I was sharing, but somehow in the middle of that, Dave Frenchak, the one who was leading the class, the one that was in charge of the whole urban training program, he called me a Pharisee. It was an insult, and he meant it to be an insult. He told me I was legalistic and that I needed to learn grace. And for some reason, it hit me that day. Now, I didn't change overnight. I continued in some of my Pharisaic ways. But more and more, grace started to grab hold of me. And it moved more from here to here, the heart. And I began to change, and I became more and more a person of grace rather than a legalistic Pharisee, legalistic, judgmental Pharisee. And I think that was important. Sometimes we view sin all wrong. We think of God sitting on his throne in heaven, this old man with a long white beard, looking down on us, kind of his arms crossed. He's kind of angry looking. And he's just waiting for us to mess up so he can zap us, judge us, condemn us. And we're afraid, God, I don't want to mess up. I want to do what's right so that God won't punish me. And if I do what's right, just maybe God might bless me. And we work on this mentality that God is angry with us and God wants to punish us because of our sin. And I want to suggest to you that we're viewing this all wrong. God has no desire to punish us because of our sin. Rather, we're punishing ourselves by our sin. And there's a difference. Our sin is bringing about the punishment, not God. Our sin is breaking relationships with God and with others. Our sin is the problem. Every one of those examples that Jesus gave about keeping the law dealt with relationships. Angry with someone, lust, divorce, being honest with people, revenge, how you deal with that, loving neighbor and enemy. Every one of those deals with a relationship. And our sin breaks relationships. And Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill the law and, dare I say, redeem the law, to redeem us. Let me tell you a story. Greg was 28 years old. His parents were very religious, and they took issue with some of his lifestyle choices. One of them, which was Greg and his girlfriend Diane lived together in sin, according to the parents, and they didn't approve. They wanted them to get married, and so at some point, Diane and Greg decided that they would get married. And they told Greg's parents, and they were happy about that. And they were going to have this nice, wonderful wedding where the family and friends would come together and celebrate. But shortly after that, Diane became pregnant. Now, you can imagine Greg's parents with that. Bad enough they lived together in sin, but now they're going to have a baby out of wedlock. Oh, gosh, will it never end? Greg and Diane decided to cancel the wedding and put that money that they would have spent on the wedding into preparing for the child that was coming. They did get married. They went to a justice of the peace, and there by themselves with the justice of the peace, they had a legal marriage. Not long after that, Greg and Diane were with some of their friends, and their friends were asking them what was married life like. And as they talked about all that had gone on, the friends decided they really didn't have a wedding. It was a non-wedding. It was an impersonal, isolated, bureaucratic, legal happening. Not a wedding. Not a celebration with friends and family. And they decided, we need to give them a wedding. And so they started contacting family and friends, and they found a date that would work. And they decided it was going to be a surprise wedding. They invited Greg and Diane to come over to one of their friends' house for a dress-up dinner. So they were all dressed up, and they come to the house, and there's some of their friends, and they take them off. They kidnap them. The men grabbed Greg and take him off to one place. The women grabbed Diane and took her to another place and threw them the bachelor party and the bachelorette party that they had not had. They grilled them. You've been married all of 3 months now. What mistakes have you made? How can we help you with your marriage? They took pictures of each spouse, and they had them write on the back of the picture what they loved about their spouse, all the things that they loved. And they just had a wonderful, grand time. And so, Greg and Diane thought this was the surprise, and they're heading back to their friend's house, and the surprise was not over yet. They walk in the door, and there's all this laughter and then yells of surprise. And all the family and friends are gathered. 60 people gathered, smushed into this living room. And the tears started to flow. Hugs and kisses, laughter and crying. All this taking place in this room. It took a long time for Greg and Diane to regain their composure. And that didn't last long, because they immediately moved into the backyard where it was all decorated with flowers all over the place, and there was a minister there waiting. And they said their vows. And then the parents made vows that they would support this marriage and this family. And then each one of the guests, each one of the friends walked up to Greg and Diane, and they whispered a blessing in their ears. This was a conspiracy of grace. This was a Jesus wedding written all over it. Jesus said, I didn't come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And I would suggest what he means by that is he came to redeem it. And he came to redeem us. We are to be in relationship with God, and we are to be in relationship with one another, and we are to be in relationship with those that are outside these walls. That's what we've been created to be. And that's what Jesus is getting at as he goes through this Sermon on the Mount. And that's what I think he's telling us today. Amen.